Hi, my name is Mike Smith. I'm a priest here in the Diocese of Southern Ohio and a member of St. James Episcopal Church on the west side of Cincinnati. And very glad that you're taking part in this study of the book of Exodus. There are a lot of moments in the story, moments of fear, moments of hope, many moments of doubt and frustration in this drama we call the Exodus story. And ultimately, the Hebrew people entered into the promised land because they continued to trust in the promises of the Holy One. In our lives, just like the lives of the Hebrew people, are about our journeys through this life to the next. Our lives are, if we're honest, a movement away from the potential slaveries of this life to the promised land introduced to us by Jesus. And like the experience of the Hebrews, we experience high points and low points during our journey. We experience moments of intense grace, but we also experience intense temptation to give in to our fears, our biases, our passions, and our greed. But the Hebrews were constantly being reassured that the Holy One was with them on that journey. And we also are assured by the teaching of Jesus, which tells us of the primacy of love and the possibility of forgiveness and the necessity of justice and mercy. Over the 2 lessons that I will be part of with you, we have the opportunity to reflect on the drama that is the book of Exodus. That drama offers much to ponder and much to apply to our lives in this day and in this age. God is continually moving ahead of us into the future glory promised to us. We each live in a state of Exodus as we wonder and we wander our way back to God into the many mansions God has prepared for God's people. We could study the book of Exodus in any number of ways. We could spend a lot of time arguing whether Exodus is to be read as an historical account of an actual mass migration of people, or we might choose to read it as a drama that reflects the core realities of our lives and of the lives of the Hebrew people as they relate to our God. We could speak of it simply as a myth with some wonderful lessons to be learned and found in the words of the drama. But our study together in the Diocese of the book of Exodus and through these videos is a little different. It's an invitation to reflect upon the lessons contained in those stories. The story of movement from slavery to freedom and from darkness to light, and the ongoing presence of a reassuring God in our lives. What's your unique Exodus story? We'll have the time to talk about those. Our series will invite reflection on the part of the Exodus story and discussion about what those reflections might mean to us as individuals and as the church during our own Exodus journeys, as individuals and as church. From the plagues to the water from the rock, from the pillar of cloud to the manna from heaven, God continues to speak to us. We'll be exploring 3 general themes in this video. The first is that of slavery. The second is the question, are we working here with an inefficient God? Why the plagues? And finally, a brief reflection on the Passover event itself. The Holy One speaks out to Moses and says, I have indeed seen the misery of the people in Egypt. I've heard them crying because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. Of all the people that God could have chosen to call God's own, who were they? God's attention was drawn to the poor, the suffering, and those stripped of their freedom, and those taken advantage of to make the lives of the wealthy even more comfortable. And at this point, Moses is commissioned by God to go and ask Pharaoh, "Let my people go." And Moses is rightfully so critical of God and of that request, and points out that he didn't even know God's name. Moses points out that people are going to be curious about who this God is and who is giving this very unusual request. And suppose I do go to the Israelites and say, "The God of your fathers has sent me to you." And they say to me, "Well, what's this God's name?" Okay, what am I supposed to say to them? And God said to Moses, "I am. Tell them that I am sent you." Being itself, the ground of all being, has sent you. So here is set the stage for the rest of the book of Exodus. God is paying attention to creation. God hears the suffering of the oppressed. God asks Moses to go to Pharaoh to ask him to let the slaves go. And God reveals a name. I am. Liberation and transformation are on the way. Is God an inefficient God? Now, at first glance, the plagues mentioned in Exodus might seem like the actions of a really vindictive God. It might also seem that Pharaoh is a very irresponsible leader, since he's allowing these plagues to do harm to his own people. The plagues provide an opportunity for God to demonstrate great power over nature. And Pharaoh demonstrates his tremendous power by increasing the intensity of the labor required of his slaves. Certainly, there is at the core of this drama a battle between God and between Pharaoh. And this part of the Exodus experience is a drama that heightens the anticipation of liberation on the part of the slaves, and which heightens the sensitivities of the Egyptians as they become the victims of Pharaoh's stubbornness. We all know that eventually the Hebrews escape with God having proven to possess great strength, even over the natural order of things. But I wonder, doesn't this all seem to point to a lack of efficiency on God's part? Could not have God simply softened Pharaoh's heart instead of hardening Pharaoh's heart? Could not God simply have skipped ahead to the last plague, the death of every eldest child? Rabbi Foreman suggests that time was of the essence here. The plagues provided the Hebrews an opportunity for them to come to better understand the power of God, but also to understand that the promises of God made to their ancestors would ultimately be fulfilled. But Rabbi Foreman also notes the plagues also provided an opportunity for Pharaoh to relent and also to become part of the chosen, if he would but let the slaves go. The plagues that we might seem to experience in our own lives can be a reminder to us that God is giving us the time and the opportunity to figure things out for ourselves. Our plagues might well be the opportunity for us to be aware of God's promise to be always with us. Wrestling with such questions can be helpful. In his book, The Art of Passing Over, Francis Dorff shares the story of a rabbi who was asked by a young boy, "Why does God no longer speak to the people?" And the rabbi responded saying, "My son, it is not that God no longer speaks to his people. It is that no one these days can stoop down low enough to listen." No one can stoop down low enough to listen. Dorff continues by saying that to experience the silence of God is to receive an invitation to stoop lower than we've ever stooped before. It's to receive an invitation to put our ear not merely to the ground, but to the ground of our being. It's an invitation to listen with all our heart for what only our hearts are able to hear. Our God is certainly not an inefficient God. We, however, are possessed with efficiency, and we often can't hear God's word due to our busyness. God still speaks through the ancient story of the Passover. If we are willing to stoop low and listen to that which is the very ground of being, the Holy One. Now, as noted by John Goldingay, it's important to pay close attention to the chronology of events when we talk about the Passover, because he notes that the instructions for how the Passover was to be observed come as a very dramatic pause in the story of Exodus. We've been talking a lot in the previous chapters about all the goings on, the plagues, etc. But then suddenly we stop. And the instructions about how to celebrate the Passover become a way for the Israelites to prepare themselves for the Exodus event, preparing themselves for the moment of deliverance. As Goldingay observes, Israel starts celebrating God's great act of deliverance before it even happens. As directed, Jews throughout history have set aside a day during the year to stop and to recall God's greatness and God's invitation to move from slavery through the desert to the promised land. Were the former slaves simply marching out into the desert without any means of supporting themselves? This is a very interesting question and an important question for us to raise, because it has something to say to us about how we treat those who have been enslaved in our own day and age. Enslavement can take many shapes and forms, not the least of which is the manner in which a nation's economy provides a sense of freedom and safety to some, but to the less fortunate, the same economy provides its own sorts of prisons. So how do we move from homelessness to permanent shelter? How do we help people provide for those who have lost their savings during the financial crisis of 2008? How do we provide for those who work but still can't make enough to buy healthy food? Brueggemann tackles this very question when he reflects on Exodus 3:20 through 22, where it is said, "I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all my wonders that I will perform in it. After that, we will let you go. I will bring this people into such favor with the Egyptians that when you go, you will not go empty-handed. Each woman shall ask her neighbor, and any woman living in the neighbor's house, for jewelry of silver and gold, and clothing, and you shall put them on your sons and your daughters, and you shall plunder the Egyptians." So the Egyptians shower gifts on the people who had been their slaves. These people who were slaves now have an upper hand on the people who enslaved them. And Brueggemann asserts two things about this passage from Exodus. First, he notes that they, the slaves, are to be treated with dignity and respect. They are to be measured in the terms that count most, economic terms. And he continues, "The slave upon release is to receive compensation from the master's goods sufficient to resume a full and viable life." The underdog is not expected to pick himself or herself up by the bootstraps. The expectation is that the one who lorded over the underdog now has an obligation to provide for that underdog so that they have a good chance at starting a new life for themselves. And so it can be said that the act of liberation involves not just a personal sense of freedom from a slave owner, but also the opportunity to live with dignity within the culture of that time. To whom do we owe something because of the slaveries in which our actions have enslaved them? The Passover is about much more than simply a meal. It's also about celebrating the dignity of those who were slaves, and a reminder to us about our responsibility to seek out the slave and the marginalized.